The late 2000s marked a dark chapter in Mexico's history. Streets once filled with life echoed with gunfire, and entire towns became battlegrounds. As rival cartels waged war and the government launched its bloody crackdown, the death toll soared past 50,000, plunging the nation into fear, corruption, and unrelenting chaos. By the late 2000s, Mexico had become a nation consumed by its own shadow. What began as a government declaration of war against powerful drug cartels evolved into an unrelenting spiral of bloodshed that tore through cities, villages, and families alike. The air thickened with fear as gunfire echoed in the night, and once thriving communities became territories of death. The official numbers told only part of the truth. Over 50,000 lives lost in a war that seemed to have no end and no clear victor. In December 2006, newly elected President Felipe Calderon declared an all-out offensive against the cartels. Wearing a military jacket, he stood before soldiers in his home state of Michoacán and announced the beginning of what would later be called Mexico's drug war. The operation began with more than 6,000 troops deployed to combat La Familia Michoacana, a criminal organization that had grown in power through methamphetamine production and brutal enforcement. Calderon's message was clear: the government would take back control. But as the soldiers rolled into cartel territories, a storm was set in motion, one that would unravel the fragile balance of power between the underworld and the state. The cartels, already divided by decades of shifting alliances, reacted with ferocity. The Sinaloa Cartel, led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, sought to expand its influence across the northern border regions. The Gulf Cartel, weakened by leadership arrests, relied on its paramilitary arm, Los Zetas, to maintain control. Los Zetas, formed by former elite soldiers who had defected to organized crime, brought with them tactics of terror that changed the face of violence in Mexico. Beheadings, mass executions, and public displays of mutilated bodies became tools of dominance and intimidation. Civilians found themselves trapped between warring factions, their lives reduced to statistics in a war that blurred the line between state and criminal power. As the government intensified its military operations, cartel alliances fractured. The once unified federation, a coalition of criminal organizations that had coordinated smuggling routes across Mexico, began to splinter under pressure. In the northern state of Tamaulipas, the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas turned on each other in a conflict that would devastate entire cities. In the west, La Familia Michoacana declared itself protectors of local communities while simultaneously enforcing their control through extortion, kidnapping, and ritualized violence. In Chihuahua, the battle for Ciudad Juárez, the most strategic smuggling corridor into the United States, turned the city into the most dangerous place on earth. Between 2008 and 2010, more than 10,000 people were killed in Juárez alone, many in daylight executions that went unanswered by law enforcement. The government's approach relied heavily on the military, but the lines of loyalty within the ranks were uncertain. Corruption seeped into local police forces, judicial systems, and even federal agencies. Soldiers sent to restore order often found themselves targeted, bribed, or infiltrated. Entire police departments were disbanded after revelations of collusion with cartel groups. Trust between citizens and the state eroded rapidly. Fear became the currency of survival. Every day brought new images of horror. Bodies hanging from bridges, messages scrawled on cardboard, gun battles erupting in the streets of Monterrey, Tijuana, and Reynosa. As the violence escalated, the drug trade itself adapted. Cartels diversified their operations beyond narcotics, expanding into human trafficking, oil theft, and kidnapping for ransom. The immense profits generated from cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine continued to flow north, feeding an insatiable demand in the United States. Despite billions spent on enforcement, the flow of drugs remained steady. What changed was the cost in human lives. Families disappeared without a trace, mass graves were uncovered in remote areas, and journalists who dared to report on the atrocities were silenced one by one. Between 2006 and 2011, more than 80 reporters were murdered or vanished, marking Mexico as one of the deadliest countries in the world for the press. Each region of Mexico told its own story of blood and betrayal. In Sinaloa, the stronghold of El Chapo's empire, cartel lieutenants fought to protect routes through the Sierra Madre Mountains, clashing with both rivals and federal troops. In Guerrero, home to the tourist city of Acapulco, violence spilled into public view as bodies appeared on beaches once crowded with travelers. In the central state of Durango, entire towns emptied as residents fled the crossfire between cartels vying for control of the Golden Triangle, a region notorious for opium poppy and marijuana cultivation. The war touched every corner of the country, leaving behind a generation scarred by loss. The power vacuum created by the government's crackdown destabilized the underworld further. With top cartel leaders captured or killed, younger, more ruthless commanders rose in their place. Each arrest or assassination created splinter groups that fought for territory, deepening the chaos. In 2009, the death of Arturo Beltran Leiva, one of the most powerful cartel figures, triggered waves of retaliatory killings across multiple states. His death, celebrated by the government as a victory, marked the beginning of a new phase, fragmentation without control. No longer a war between two sides, it became a war of many, each faction more violent than the last. As the death toll climbed, international attention turned toward Mexico. Human rights organizations documented the widespread abuses committed not only by cartels but also by security forces. Reports of torture, unlawful detentions, and extrajudicial killings surfaced, casting doubt on the government's strategy. Yet, for many ordinary Mexicans, there was no alternative. The state was both protector and predator, and the cartels were both enemy and employer. In rural areas where the government's presence was weak, criminal groups provided social aid, built roads, and enforced their own form of justice. The boundaries between legality and survival blurred until they became indistinguishable. By 2010, the scale of violence had surpassed all expectations. Over 50,000 deaths were officially recorded, though many more went uncounted. Those buried in clandestine graves, those burned beyond recognition, those whose disappearance was never reported out of fear. Entire generations grew up surrounded by conflict. Children learned to drop to the ground at the sound of gunfire. In cities like Monterrey, businessmen traveled in armored cars and avoided night streets. In Michoacán, villagers lived under curfews imposed not by the government, but by the criminal organizations that ruled their lands. Behind the headlines and statistics lay the deep currents of poverty, corruption, and geopolitical pressure that had shaped the crisis. The cartels were not born overnight. They were the product of decades of smuggling routes, government complicity, and foreign demand. When the Colombian cartels were dismantled in the 1990s, Mexico became the new hub for the global drug trade. The profits transformed local traffickers into paramilitary forces equipped with advanced weapons and vehicles. U.S.-EU supplied firearms smuggled south through the same borders used for drugs, armed both sides of the conflict. As each year passed, the arsenals grew deadlier and the casualties mounted. Ciudad Juarez became the symbol of this descent. The city's location across from El Paso, Texas, made it one of the most valuable drug corridors in the world. When the Juarez cartel lost ground to Sinaloa forces, the battle turned the city into a war zone. Daily killings became routine. Residents woke to the sound of gunfire and closed their businesses in fear. Factories known as maquiladoras, once employing thousands, shuttered as workers fled. The morgues overflowed, and hospitals could no longer handle the wounded. U.S. border agents watched from across the Rio Grande as smoke rose from burning vehicles, and the sound of chaos echoed across the river. The brutality reached new heights as Los Zetas expanded their reign. Originally trained as Mexico's elite military forces, their defection to organized crime introduced a level of discipline and military strategy unseen before. They used kidnapping as a weapon of control and public terror as propaganda. Their methods spread to rival groups, who adopted the same savage tactics to prove dominance. The once clandestine world of the cartels became a theater of psychological warfare, where public displays of violence served as both warning and recruitment. Meanwhile, the Mexican government, supported by U.S. funding through the M.A. initiative, continued to claim progress. Tons of drugs were seized, high-profile arrests were made, and cartels were declared dismantled. But the reality on the ground told another story. Every time one cartel fell, two others rose. Every arrest left a void that unleashed another wave of killing. The strategy that was meant to restore peace only deepened the cycle of conflict. For the people caught in the middle, survival became the only goal. In border towns like Reynosa and Nuevo Laredo, daily life revolved around uncertainty. Schools closed without warning. Businesses paid protection money or faced destruction. Parents taught their children not to look at convoys of armed men. The military checkpoints that dotted the highways offered little safety. Sometimes the uniforms were genuine. Other times they belonged to cartels disguised as soldiers. Mistrust ran so deep that even the sound of helicopters overhead could mean either rescue or death. By the end of the decade, Mexico's landscape was forever changed. The once clear distinction between the state and the underworld had blurred into a single, sprawling network of violence and influence. More than 50,000 were dead, tens of thousands missing, and millions displaced. The war had consumed everything: cities, institutions, faith, and the very idea of safety. It was no longer just a battle for territory or drugs. It had become a struggle for the nation's soul, a fight against a darkness that seemed to spread with every life it claimed. By 2010, the war had entered a new and unpredictable phase. The death toll had already surpassed 50,000, and the promises of victory faded into the noise of daily gunfire. Mexico had become a nation living under siege, a place where every street corner told a story of loss. The old order of cartel power was breaking apart, and in its collapse, new wars erupted, more chaotic and ruthless than those before. The capture or death of each cartel leader no longer brought peace. It only redrew the map of violence. In the northern borderlands, Ciudad Juarez remained the center of a storm that refused to die. The battle between the Sinaloa Cartel and the Juarez Cartel continued with relentless brutality. The city's once bustling nightclubs and factories were now symbols of desolation, their walls scarred by bullets, their streets patrolled by convoys of masked men. Between 2010 and 2011, the death toll in Juarez reached levels unseen in modern Latin America. Even the federal troops stationed in the city found themselves overwhelmed by the scale of the killings. Families fled north toward the U.S. border, leaving behind abandoned homes that became outposts for gunmen and informants. The violence was not confined to Joe Res. Across the Gulf Coast, Los Zetas expanded their operations with military precision. They moved through Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and Veracruz, taking control of vital smuggling corridors once held by their former allies, the Gulf Cartel. The alliance between the two groups had shattered in 2010, and the conflict that followed spread like wildfire. Towns such as Reynosa, Matamoros, and San Fernando became synonymous with massacres and disappearances. In August 2010, authorities discovered a mass grave in San Fernando containing the bodies of 72 migrants who had been kidnapped and executed by Los Zetas. The victims, traveling north in search of a better life, had refused to work for the cartel and were killed as a warning to others. The news shocked the world, but barely slowed the rhythm of killing that continued across the region. The federal government responded with more troops and more arrests. Felipe Calderón's administration announced the deployment of thousands of soldiers to Tamaulipas and Nuevo León in an effort to reclaim control of highways and towns seized by organized crime. Convoys of armored vehicles rolled through streets that had already become ghostly, their shops shuttered and residents too afraid to emerge. Despite the show of force, the cartels adapted quickly, using superior intelligence networks and local informants to anticipate military movements. Corruption remained a constant enemy. Information about raids often leaked before operations began, rendering many missions futile. In Michoacán, the state where the war had begun, La Familia Michoacana continued to assert its influence under the banner of pseudo-religious ideology. They called themselves protectors of the people, yet their form of justice was written in blood. In December 2010, their leader Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, known as El Más Loco, was reported killed during a federal operation. The government announced his death, but his body was never recovered. Rumors of his survival spread across the region, fueling myths and fear. Within months, the organization splintered, giving rise to a new and even more unpredictable force, the Knights Templar, operating under a similar code of fanatic discipline. They combined religious rhetoric with brutal enforcement, continuing the cycle of extortion, kidnapping, and murder that had come to define daily life in Michoacán. While some cartels fractured, others consolidated power. The Sinaloa Cartel, led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, capitalized on the chaos to expand its empire. Their reach extended from the Pacific coast to the U.S. border, dominating trafficking routes through Sonora, Durango, and Chihuahua. The organization's strategy was calculated: bribe, infiltrate, and eliminate. They forged temporary alliances with smaller groups, absorbed local gangs, and used immense financial resources to corrupt officials. Their influence reached deep into law enforcement and politics, making it difficult for the government to strike a decisive blow. By 2011, Sinaloa had become the most powerful criminal organization in the Western Hemisphere, responsible for much of the cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine flowing into the United States. In Guerrero, Oaxaca, and parts of the Central Highlands, new criminal bands emerged, many formed by disillusioned former members of established cartels. Groups like the Independent Cartel of Acapulco and Guerreros Unidos fought for control of local drug distribution and extortion networks. Their conflicts transformed tourist cities into battlegrounds. Acapulco, once a playground for the wealthy, descended into terror. Bodies appeared along the beaches, and shootings broke out near luxury hotels. Residents learned to live with curfews imposed by fear, and international tourism collapsed under the weight of the city's reputation for violence. In the midst of this turmoil, ordinary citizens sought to reclaim their communities. In small towns across Michoacán, Guerrero, and Oaxaca, self-defense militias began to form. Armed with hunting rifles and improvised weapons, farmers and laborers organized patrols to protect themselves from kidnappers and extortionists. At first, these groups operated independently of the government, driven by desperation rather than ideology. But as their numbers grew, so did their power. Some aligned with local authorities, while others became indistinguishable from the criminals they fought. The rise of these militias reflected a deeper truth. The state's authority had fractured, and the people no longer trusted it to keep them safe. 2011 marked one of the bloodiest years in modern Mexican history. More than 20,000 homicides were recorded, though the true number was likely far higher. Mass graves continued to surface across the country. In Durango, investigators uncovered dozens of bodies buried in abandoned lots. In Veracruz, dismembered victims were dumped along highways and in public plazas as messages of dominance from warring cartels. Each discovery revealed the scale of a crisis that no longer fit within official statistics. The war had taken on a life of its own, fed by revenge, corruption, and profit. International attention intensified as Mexico's war spilled beyond its borders. The United States, concerned about the growing power of cartels, increased cooperation through the M.A. Reader Initiative, providing training, intelligence, and equipment to Mexican forces. But the results were mixed. While the assistance improved surveillance and communication, it also drew criticism for deepening the militarization of Mexican society. Civilian casualties rose as the military engaged in urban combat, and reports of abuses by soldiers and police multiplied. Families of the disappeared demanded answers, forming movements that marched through cities carrying photographs of their missing loved ones. Their voices became a haunting echo in the national conscience, a reminder that behind every number was a human story. In February 2011, the discovery of more mass graves in San Fernando added another chapter to the horror. This time, 193 bodies were found, victims of a series of bus hijackings carried out by Los Zetas. Passengers traveling north were kidnapped, interrogated, and killed if they refused to join the cartel. The massacre revealed the scale of impunity with which these groups operated. The highways that connected Mexico's industrial centers to the border had become corridors of death. Even military convoys risked ambushes along the routes once considered safe. As 2012 approached, political winds began to shift. Felipe Calderon's presidency was nearing its end, and public opinion had turned sharply against the war. The toll of years of conflict weighed heavily on the nation. More than 60,000 people were dead, tens of thousands missing, and millions living under constant threat. Entire regions had become ungovernable, controlled by armed groups rather than elected officials. Calderon defended his strategy until the last day of his term, arguing that the offensive had weakened the cartels and laid the groundwork for future stability. But for most Mexicans, the cost had overshadowed the promise. In July 2012, Enrique Pida Nieto of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, won the presidency, promising a new approach. His administration aimed to shift the focus from confrontation to containment, emphasizing economic reform and institutional rebuilding. The rhetoric of war softened, and federal forces began to withdraw from some conflict zones. Yet the cartels did not retreat. Instead, they adapted to the change in tone, consolidating their businesses and expanding into new ventures. Extortion, illegal mining, fuel theft, and human trafficking became major sources of income. The government's reduced emphasis on direct combat allowed cartels to reorganize, creating a temporary lull that masked the underlying instability. The Sinaloa Cartel, at the height of its power, continued to dominate the drug trade. El Chapo Guzman operated from hidden strongholds in the mountains of Sinaloa, protected by a network of informants and loyal gunmen. Despite multiple military operations, he remained elusive. His legend grew with each failed attempt to capture him, turning him into both a symbol of defiance and the embodiment of the state's failure. At the same time, the fragmentation of other cartels produced new adversaries. The Beltran-Leyva organization, once allies of Sinaloa, declared open war after Arturo Beltran-Leyva's death. Smaller factions like Los Rojos and Los Ardillos emerged from the remnants of older groups, bringing new waves of violence to central and southern Mexico. In the state of Jalisco, a new force began to rise. The cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, known as CJNG, formed from the remnants of the Milenio Cartel. It was led by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, alias El Mencho. Between 2011 and 2013, the group expanded rapidly, using a combination of ruthless violence and sophisticated organization to seize control of key trafficking routes. Their emergence marked the beginning of a new era in Mexico's criminal landscape, one defined by even greater fragmentation and competition. CJNG's ascent coincided with the decline of older organizations, positioning it as the next major power in the years to come. Meanwhile, in the rural heartlands of Michoacán, the Knights Templar strengthened their grip. They imposed their own codes of conduct, collected taxes from local businesses, and claimed to defend the region from external threats. Their propaganda mixed religious imagery with messages of justice, but their actions revealed a regime of fear. In response, the self-defense militias that had formed years earlier began to unite under coordinated leadership. Clashes between the militias and the Knights Templar escalated, drawing the attention of the federal government. What began as a local resistance movement soon grew into a full-scale conflict, further complicating an already fragmented war. By 2013, Mexico's landscape bore the scars of a decade of violence. The once powerful cartels of the early 2000s had either disintegrated or evolved into networks of smaller, more agile organizations. The death of Ignacio, Naco, Coronel, a key figure in Sinaloa, and the downfall of the Beltran-Leyva brothers had reshuffled the hierarchy of the underworld. But the violence persisted. Kidnappings, disappearances, and massacres remained part of daily life. The number of unidentified bodies buried in mass graves continued to rise. Each discovery reopened wounds that had never healed. International observers noted a shift in the nature of the conflict. The war that began as a campaign against drug trafficking had become a broader struggle over control, influence, and survival. Cartels no longer fought only for smuggling routes, they sought dominance over entire economies. From fuel pipelines to avocado farms, every industry became a potential source of profit. Corruption ensured their reach extended far beyond the underworld. In many regions, mayors, police chiefs, and business leaders owed their positions to criminal alliances. The line between crime and governance blurred until it was nearly invisible. By the end of 2013, the illusion of peace promoted by the new administration began to unravel. While national statistics suggested a slight decline in homicides, violence in key states intensified. In Michoacán, Guerrero, and Tamaulipas, the battles between rival groups escalated. The federal government prepared a renewed intervention as reports emerged of towns taken over by cartels and self-defense groups alike. The same cycle that had begun years earlier, military deployment, temporary calm, renewed chaos, was set to repeat once more. Mexico entered the following year with the same uncertainty that had defined the previous decade. The war that began as a promise to restore order had instead reshaped the nation's soul. Cities rebuilt under the shadow of memory. Families carried photographs of the missing, hoping for answers that never came. The drug routes continued to flow north, the weapons south, and the blood unceasingly in between. The late 2000s and early 2010s would forever be remembered as the years when Mexico descended into its darkest hour, a time when power, fear, and survival merged into one unending struggle that left no part of the country untouched.